Alright, time for a new project. Today we're going to build a workbench. A workbench that is designed to accommodate my table saw. One of the challenges with art in all of its forms is workflow. How you take your product and you move it from station to station. And in relation to working with a table saw, you really want to have a countertop that is almost precisely the same height. Either precisely the same height as the table saw or possibly like a millimeter lower in height. If you don't have that, it can be really difficult to get proper cuts with a table saw. So I have some old 2x8s left over from some of my summer projects. And my plan is to rip these down into 3-inch width pieces and frame up a table saw with them. So here I'm just taking my measurements of my casters, of the table saw height. I'm looking at how I can do my cuts on the table saw, making the best use of the wood. So there's a couple measurements that are key. One would be the height of the table saw is a non-negotiable, but the other two dimensions are negotiable. So when you're doing a project like this, you really want to map out your cuts as best as you can. Otherwise, you're going to risk wasting a lot of wood if you just don't think about how you're going to utilize your product. And I live a little ways from a lumber mill, so or a lumber yard, so I didn't want to have to go and make a special trip or get a special delivery. I wanted to just work with what I had lying around. So here I'm just running my 2x8s through the table saw, and you might be able to tell from this video that it's actually a little bit cold in the garage. That's what you get when you work in an unheated garage in Canada. I think it's about minus 20 outside, so that means it's about minus 20 inside as well. So here I'm just looking at kind of the curvature on the boards, figuring out what would be the best ones for some of the longer cuts. The workbench is going to be about 78 inches long in its framing. The table top will probably be a little longer than that, and so I wanted to use the straightest pieces of board for the longer cuts, because that is going to ensure that you get the best geometry out of your design. So I do the longest cuts first out of the best pieces of wood, and then if some of the wood is a little more curved and you do some shorter cuts, usually it doesn't have much of an impact on the project. So here I'm doing some, I think these ones here are the verticals. I think initially here I did them at 32 inches. Later I scaled them down a little bit. So I set up a bit of a jig there, and that's great because when you have to make multiple cuts, I think I did a number of them, it really saves a lot of time because you don't have to measure every single time. And so typically I just grab a piece of wood that looks relatively straight, grab a square and pinch it down with a couple of these clamps, and you're good to go. You can just run cut after cut. I realized after I had done my cuts, I needed a little more wood. I didn't want to rip the third to 2x8 yet, so I found some pieces of scrap lying around here, and I was able to get a few more 3-inch pieces out of these, 3-inch wide. So that means the pieces are going to be like 1.5 inches by 3 inches, and so I'm going to use those to construct the table saw with here. And again, I already have my jig set up, so I can just go through and without having to measure and make my cuts fairly quickly. So there we go. I got 4 78-inch pieces. I've got looks like 6 verticals there. I think those are 32 inches each, and then I have stack of shorter cuts. Here I have some casters. These are going to go on the base of the tables, or of the workbench, I should say. And whenever you're putting casters on something, especially if it's going to be load-bearing, something that can handle a lot of weight, or you plan to put a lot of weight on it, you really got to think about how you're going to frame that up. Here, assembling the kind of the top and bottom portions of the workbench, I used an existing workbench that I have, and actually I put a nice bit of an L design into that. You'll see from some of the camera angles, and it really works great for working on larger stuff. But by putting it against a flat surface like this, I could help to ensure that my joints were going to be flush and parallel. I didn't use a square to check the corners for 90 degrees, but I figured they're cut square enough, it should be fine. Here I'm pre-drilling before I drill. That can really help to avoid splitting the ends. Since I wouldn't want to have to recut one of these longer boards, I just do what I can to avoid splitting. Here you can see I have 4 screws laid out. One's a 5-inch, that one's a 4-inch, the next one's a 3, and then the last one will be a 2.5-inch screw. I ran out of these 4-inch screws. They're really nice because they have that nice notch in the end, which enables them to be self-drilling. And if you have self-drilling or self-tapping screws, it really reduces the risk or the odds of splitting wood, especially when you're running such a large screw through it. So I had to run out and grab a few more. So here I realized my verticals were 32 inches, and I forgot to account for the casters, so I shaved them down 5 inches. And I'm just attaching them here. I wanted to attach the first set using my existing workbench. That way I could ensure that I would have like some proper 90s on those. At this point in the project, I realized I needed to find a decent way of clamping this to the workbench, and I found just putting it vertical and putting a couple clamps on there did the trick just fine. So if you like the background music, this is all stuff that I've designed in the past when I was looking at doing some cinematic sound design, soundscapes, and that kind of thing. I've always been a fairly creative person. I don't like to sit still in the evenings and do nothing. I like to explore my creative side and build stuff and make stuff, whatever. All the cabinets and the benches and the different stations in my garage I built by hand over the years. I have a number of other projects that I plan on building to help me with the overall workflow in the garage. I'm not typically someone who likes to just go out and get everything all at once. For one, it's a lot of money. But two, then you don't usually invest the time you need to invest in order to learn how all your various tools and equipment work and what you can do with them and so forth. So it's more my style to carefully and methodically add equipment to my workflow, and to keep fine-tuning and polishing my workflow and how I do things. And when you do that, you get to the point where you can look at a project, and in your mind's eye, you can basically break it down very quickly to a series of steps and so forth. So this is the basic box frame structure of the workbench. And what's interesting is most projects really are boxes. They're either collections of boxes or, different shaped boxes, but almost every project starts from a series of basic box geometry. I realized at this point in the project I wanted a few more cross pieces cut for the base of the table saw. All right, time for a break. One of the neat things about building something or doing a new project is you got to have these little moments of downtime where you enjoy a nice cup of coffee, you look at what you've accomplished, where you've made it, and where you got to go next to complete your project. So here I'm just measuring the workbench, coming up with a plan as to where I'm going to connect all my cross beams and cross braces. I need to make sure that the casters can feed in to that system in such a way that the tension from the weight gets distributed both to the bottom section of the table saw or of the workbench and to the top section as well. So you can see here from the vertical beams that they line up perfectly with the casters below, and that's going to help distribute weight tensions throughout the workbench table. One of the plans I have is to put some gear in there, specifically a vacuum, and so I'm just checking to make sure that my measurements were correct and that I can get it through that little gap there. And I'm hoping to have somewhat of a dust collection system built into this thing in the near future. And one of the nice things about that is if it's all enclosed and I turn it on, it should really help keep the noise down. So here we go again. I'm pre-drilling and drilling this together. So you can see my makeshift setup here. I probably put down more cross bracing on the base of this than I needed. But part of the challenge was I had to work around those casters, and I wanted it to be fairly symmetrical in its layout. And I didn't want to go beyond maybe say 18 inches because there is going to be plywood in there holding some equipment in the future, and I don't know offhand how heavy that equipment is going to be, so I played it safe and all right, time for a break. Oh boy, wipeout. Back to work. So here's the top framing. As you can see, I just used 4 pieces. This was a 2x6 that I had, and chopped that up. And I figured 4 would be about right. The top part of the bench is a little more critical in some ways. So here we go. When you're a big guy like me, you can test the quality of your work by sitting on it or lying on it. And I don't recommend that necessarily for people who build acoustic guitars or fancy things like that. There we go, it didn't budge. Mission accomplished. So if it can hold me up, it's pretty much guaranteed it's gonna stand the test of time. So now I'm at the point where I'm ready to take the steps to set the surface on the workbench, but I needed to get all the dust out of the garage because I need it to be fairly flush on the cement floor with the table saw. Lifting some MDF. This is maybe a little more than half a sheet here. MDF is heavy. I don't know if you've ever lifted that stuff, but it's usually a 2-man job because it's pretty hard to work with. So I have 2 sheets of MDF on the workbench, and you can see here it's quite flush with the table saw itself, and that's what I was going for. I think the final product actually works out a little better than that. So here we go. Needed to get some help to get these things lifted up. And because I have 2 sheets of MDF on the workbench already, I can actually use it kind of in a functional way, even though they're just kind of resting there, to help me make some of my master cuts for the workbench itself. So what I'm doing here is I'm trimming, I think, 8 to 10 inches off these boards. That means that my workbench table surface is going to be 40 inches deep, and that's going to overhang a few inches over the frame, which is about 36 inches deep. And I want it to overhang out the back a little more than the front. So I cut the other piece here as well. I ended up swapping those two pieces and using the workbench in the same fashion. So the next step is I need to do a crosscut. And I considered using my table saw to do a crosscut, but doing crosscuts on a table saw is not fun unless you have a really wide table surface to work with, especially if you're doing a crosscut on something this long. So here's a little trick for you. I grab a couple of squares and I pinch those down, take my measurements first, of course, and put a ruler in place, a metal ruler, and use squares to make sure that everything is a perfect 90. And then I use the base plate on my skill saw up against that metal ruler, and you can just get laser accurate cuts doing that. And this is something I've done both with wood being, laid flat like this, and also vertically. Sometimes I'll just pull wood a little bit out of my kind of my plywood case, and I'll do the same thing with the wood being vertical, and I can just run my cut, and it works out great. So there we go. I wasn't sure if this was necessarily the best thing to do or not, but I decided to work this down with glue, and before I put the two sheets of MDF together. Each one is 3/4 of an inch deep, and so put them together and you have 1.5 inch thick table surface. I'm not a big fan of MDF. But I do like how smooth and how perfect you can get cuts and dimensions to be when you're working with MDF. That's something you don't get with regular wood as easy. But of course, one of the challenges with MDF is that you have to pre-drill everything. You have to be prepared to glue stuff. It just doesn't have that fibrous advantage that standard woods or plywoods have. So it's a little dusty in the garage here, but so you can see my workbench in the back there. And what I'm doing now is what I did is I clamped it down with the glue, put some heavy things on it overnight, in hopes to get a good connection with the glue. Of course, it's cold enough in the garage that the glue may just be frozen till spring, but whatever. Wanted to give it at least a good head start. So what I'm doing now is I need to find a way to make sure that the workbench surface is going to be on the workbench in a symmetrical fashion. So I'm cutting some 2-inch and 3-inch spacers here, which I'm going to clamp around the underside of the base of this workbench table. And what I can do then is I can use a rubber mallet to line up the tabletop of this workbench to the outsides of these things, and then I'll know for sure that the table itself is in fact perfectly symmetrical with the tabletop to the table base. So that's the goal there. I also walked around the whole tabletop with a set of spacers just to double check every area of it. Whenever you're working with MDF, you definitely want to pre-drill before you put screws in, especially through 2 sheets of MDF. So I found that when I put the screws in, it was starting to actually delaminate the glue a little bit, so I had to make sure to pre-drill them. So here we go. I have a nice big working surface now. And if you look real close, that's perfect. It's like maybe tops 1 millimeter down from the table saw. And that's what I was going for. So, and that's great because now I can run my really long cuts, long boards and big sheets of plywood or whatever from the table saw to the workbench, and because I have that, you don't really need an extra set of hands for some of the larger, more technical cuts that you need to make. So here we go. Now what I'm doing is I'm setting up the bottom of the workbench. I need to cut some plywood to go in the bottom. Same deal, I'm going to clamp this thing down after I check my cut measurements here and get that laser accurate cross cut using that technique. And now I'm measuring the frame on the workbench itself, and I'm using those same 2 and 3 inch spacers that I cut before to kind of draw out the cuts that I'm going to need to make to the plywood base so that it will actually fit into the bottom of the workbench. And so I basically go through, just use my Jiffy marker to highlight this. It's one of these things where I'm not too worried about anyone seeing the Jiffy marker afterwards. It's going to be inside, no one's going to be seeing it. So otherwise, if this was an outside finished piece, I probably wouldn't use a Jiffy marker. And so I go through with the jigsaw and I just cut all those notches out. And when I'm done, I have a piece that should, in theory, just fit inside the inside of the workbench there. And so there we go. And of course, what this will allow me to do is fill it up with all kinds of stuff. And with the number of cross beams that I have on the base of this thing and a piece of plywood like this, this thing can hold a lot of weight. I'll probably never put the amount of weight on it that it could actually hold. But because of that too, I don't have to worry about it twisting and bending out of shape so much in the long haul. Across the back, I'll have a piece of plywood, and that will also add to its horizontal rigidity in the long term. So I'm just going to load it full of some stuff that's crowding my garage floor here, and there we go. That's kind of stage one of building a workbench. So now I have a nice laser flat surface on this thing with the MDF. It's almost exactly the same height as the table saw itself, and this is really going to improve my workflow as a carpenter and so forth. Hey, right now you're thinking that music is a little over the top for a workbench video. You're correct, but let's just go with it. Thanks for checking out my video. Some of you are probably wondering what a workbench like this costs to put together. You're looking at 2 sheets of MDF, preferably 3/4 of an inch thick. Maybe about 4 2x8s at 12 foot long if you want to rip them. Otherwise, you're going to have to get some 2x4s, the equivalent in 2x4s, of course. 1 2x6 12 foot long, and 1 sheet of plywood, maybe 1/2 inch thick, and a set of casters. So altogether, you're looking at, in Canadian dollars, roughly $200 to $250, depending on where you pick up your supplies. Thanks again for watching my video. If you like what I'm doing here, be sure to click subscribe, and we'll see where this goes.